And we're good to go. So welcome, Riley Jimison. Some of you, if you've watched the channel before, have met Riley. He's got his own YouTube channel, Riley's Reptiles. Put a link in the description and in the Zoom invite. So welcome, Riley. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for coming on and doing this again. Tell me a little bit about yourself and what you've done with reptiles for those who haven't seen the previous episodes.
Yeah. For people who basically don't know who I am, which is a weird sentence to say because I guess that means I've been around long enough for that to be valid. But lifelong reptile enthusiast, and then got into zookeeping towards the end of my college career in like 2010, 11. And then got hired on and made that a profession for about 7-8 years, and just kind of happenstance transitioned more from the zoological field into the private side of keeping on a professional level, even though I'd been keeping as a hobbyist at home, but shifted from making my day job the zoo career to more of a private breeding facility / retail shop about a year ago. So
Awesome. And for those who don't know, Riley's a regular fixture on the NPR radio network. Carpets and Coffee, too, is where I always listen to him if I'm not watching his YouTubes. So, Riley, let me ask you, why won't my snake eat?
That's a pretty complicated question with a lot to unpack before we really dive into what could be at play, because there's a lot of factors involved in what might prevent a snake from wanting to eat.
Perfect. So what factors can be involved in a snake not eating? And we'll kind of just tick down the list.
I mean, if we wanna do like a general sort of like here's the conglomeration of ideas, and then unpack it kind of like a dichotomous key as you sort of like triage different ideas and troubleshoot things. The first thing is always making sure your husbandry is on point. So husbandry parameters, i.e. the ambient temperatures, the hot spot or lack thereof, or cool end, humidity, availability of security like hides or substrate to burrow in, adequate water, lighting or lack thereof, depending on the species. Some animals are very high stressed when things are very visible and exposed. Seasonality could have a play or a role at play there. The prey item itself could be something unfamiliar. There's a lot. I mean, there's even more that I'm sure I'm like just not thinking of right off the top of my head. But yeah, a lot of husbandry factors, prey item, enclosure variables, maybe some breeding related variables, animals kind of in a certain cycle and not interested in feeding depending on the time of the year and maturity of the animal involved. Whether it's a fresh import versus long-term captive versus a captive born and bred animal can definitely influence that. And it's not a straightforward, simple thing. There's a lot to it.
No, there's a lot to it, right? And so let's start with some of those things that you mentioned. Why would temperatures be important? How does that drive a snake to eat or not eat?
For the most part, being ectothermic, these animals require adequate heat source to digest food. If they don't feel like they are around a warm enough area to digest food, they might forego the opportunity to feed. If it's a winter time and it's colder, that could play a factor. If it's too hot and the animal feels stressed out, that could play a role. If it's too cold, the animal isn't at an ideal operating temperature for the species. It might not even have the energy to go forth with a feeding opportunity. So the climate itself is often directly involved in a snake's inhabitants, and I like to go with that first, because if we're just going to go down the line of like some of the easiest things to fix if they are at play, fixing a hot spot or fixing the ambient temperatures or ambient humidity is usually the first step, and often the easiest thing to reconcile if there's any discrepancies involved.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then obviously, each snake is going to have its ideal range. So the hotspot for a ball python is not the same as it is for a crebo or a king snake, or a boa, right?
Absolutely. This is all going to be very species specific. If anybody is listening to this and taking notes to try and triage an ongoing situation, the key behind taking any of this information and implementing it successfully is to also be aware of what the species in question is in need of as far as what they like.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's some things that can transfer over from species to species, like you'd mentioned the security too, right? So why would feeling secure and having that sort of complexity to the cages help them feed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm a huge proponent of speaking on and paying attention to your individual animal's confidence levels. And there are species stereotypes, whatever you want to say, that are like certain species are more nervous than others. Some species are more confident than others. At certain ages, they might be more confident than, say, a neonate would be. So there's some variation there. Very nocturnal animals might be reluctant to feed during the daytime because they're aware of the photoperiod that's going on with the lights on in the room. Some diurnal species might be reluctant to feed at night for the opposite reason. They're sleeping, they've shut down, they're not really visually cued in, and to try and offer something food in the dark like that might stress them out. So, yeah.
I think that's a great point. A lot of snakes get real vulnerable with a big meal in them. So if they don't feel safe to begin with, they're not going to want to chow down and get weighed down by having a mouse in their belly.
Yeah.
Tell me, so one thing you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was a seasonal cycle, because inside our rooms, some of us, if we only have, one snake, we've got maybe a heat lamp, maybe just a heat pad, a tank, and the lights come on at 8, they go off at 8 every day. So to them, they're not really getting a season. So why would the seasons, if it is say a North American snake that is used to 4 seasons, if it is a seasonal thing, why would a snake decide to go off if we're controlling its environment?
As much as we like to think we're in control of everything, these animals are aware of barometric pressure drops outside of the room. They're aware of the change in the length of day through the windows, and they have a biology they can pick up on this. And as much as we want to control the enclosure parameters, the ambient temperature of the room, the ambient photo period of the room that animal is kept in, is ultimately going to be out of our control for the most part. They can pick up when the storm's coming through, pressure drops and things are very, very significant for a lot of species in their reproductive cycle. So as much as we like to control things, they are very biologically programmed to operate on a certain wavelength, a certain level, and do things seasonally for the most part. Some equatorial species, not so much. But if we're talking about like, a corn snake, they experience winters, they experience all the 4 seasons. So it is very biologically programmed into some of these genus to follow food availability cycles and temperature, and not feed when the operating temperatures do not accommodate the ability to digest. And that also happens to coincide with food availability during those winter seasons when prey's food availability decreases as well. So it's this whole seasonal thing. Now, again, everything I'm going to say is like species specific asterisk, of course. So, for example, we've got a king snake in the shop. The snake room in the shop has no windows or anything outside because it's in a warehouse, but this animal is aware of what's going on seasonally, and it's decided to stop eating last week, which is uncharacteristic for this animal, but makes sense for an adult female starting this time of year. You talk to a lot of colubrid breeders, they're starting to get their animals ready for going down for brumation here. So
yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Thank you. Another thing you mentioned was the import versus a captive bred snake. So sure. Why would they eat differently? Why would that be any different? The snake's a snake, right?
I mean, sometimes it's not different. Sometimes it isn't. I've definitely gotten in imported popwood carpet pythons that hit the ground running and don't seem to miss a beat. But then there are animals that, whether it be the length of journey they've come from, or they're just a picky or different species in general, sometimes the transition to a captive lifestyle takes longer for certain animals to adjust to and feel comfortable. So you will find that, bringing in a wild caught ball python versus a 10 generations deep individual, their stress levels are going to be different. Their reluctance to eat is going to be different. Not always, but yeah, across the board, imports tend to take some acclimation and getting used to what's going on around them versus animals that for generations, their parents, grandparents, so on and so forth, were sort of brought into this world and fostered into this system and this climate. And even though they are still biological entities that sort of have a pre-programmed nature to them, there is a difference for sure.
I think that's really interesting because I see a lot of folks that maybe don't have a snake, and maybe they've got it usually is like a kid thing. They say, my son or daughter found this snake outside and we picked it up and it's friendly, because it didn't bite them while they grabbed it. And they try and keep it. And for a few months go by and they say, I can't get it to eat. What's going on?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that's just something that some snakes just aren't cut out for in captivity. Some, especially ones that were born in the wild.
Yeah, I would imagine that even an experienced keeper, say somebody who's kept a few animals, plucking a wild caught garter snake, legal, of course, in most states if you're doing it that way, versus getting a captive born and bred one, it's going to be different. That animal it's kind of grown up with this pre-programmed instinctual generation to generation of strong genetics, passing it on to be wary, to be flighty, to be very survival programmed, whereas an animal that might even be 2-3 generations in at the least has already got some of that pattern of behavior change from a few generations. It's interesting. Of course there are always picky feeders within captive born and bred animals, but for whatever reason, the acclimation process, the going from a very vulnerable and constantly on survival mode environment to an unfamiliar, seemingly sterile, stable environment, you would think it would be more comfortable because it's limited, it's predator free, it tends to be predictable almost after a certain while.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just different enough, especially if you're talking about bringing in something that's been in the wild for a significant period of time versus like an imported baby. An imported baby tends to acclimate pretty quickly because it hasn't had a bank of experiences built up in its mind to understand this is what life is and this is how we survive, versus grabbing an adult out of the wild that's been living like this for X amount of years. It's already set in its ways because that's how it knows how to survive. So
that makes perfect sense. Well, so let me ask you then. Let's say I've adopted a snake, a corn snake. It's April. It's a young snake, and it hasn't been eaten for a while. Or let's say it's June. Say it's middle summer, so it's been awake for a while. It hasn't been eating. I've got the temperatures down right. The hotspot's perfect. It's got some hiding spots. What sort of things would you think of? Like, what are some feeding tricks that you might try? I've been offering it frozen thawed, fuzzy mice. That's the right size for it. What sort of steps would you take to get it to eat?
So if you've just gotten this in, we're assuming it's a captive bred corn snake or something like that. I would say if the first couple offerings, I would offer frozen thawed. Like if that's what it's been doing, offer it a couple times. If it refuses a couple times over the course of a few weeks, then I consider it a back step to kind of go back to the instinctual basics and get it a live rodent. These animals in the wild will regularly feed on a whole host of different things. So they're somewhat generalist feeders, but sometimes just going back to a live rodent really kicks them into gear. I actually have a baby that came to me established on frozen thawed, and since he came to me, decided he was going to revert back to live, which is fine because I have access to it. But it's interesting. Sometimes you just need to play that game with them for a little bit. So what I like to do is, path of least resistance is get them on frozen thawed from the get-go. If that doesn't work, you go back a step, get them on live. Sometimes the movement, the heartbeat, just everything about a live rodent or a live prey item is hard for them to ignore. Now, if that doesn't do it, being how small they are, you have some limited options. One thing I would do if the live rodent itself in the enclosure is not working, I would go to a cupping technique where I take I think it's like a 32 or it's a 16-ounce deli cup. It's about 3 by 4 inches or so. Put it with a ventilated lid so it can have air exchange, and then I would put that baby corn snake in there with the live rodent and put it kind of in the middle of the enclosure, so it has kind of like a mid-range of the thermal gradient, and then I would leave it alone in the dark for as much as possible, the evening, if not overnight. If the next day that rodent is still in there, I would try the same thing with frozen thawed. Do the same process, give it about 4 or 5 days to relax back home, and then do it again. If the frozen thawed and live thing in a cupping technique doesn't work, then I would try a few other things. And that's when I start getting into scenting, which is essentially washing the rodent while it is thawed. Because at this point, we already know live versus thawed or frozen thawed isn't simply the variable in itself. So for convenience sake, I'm grabbing frozen thawed pinkies or fuzzies. I'm thawing them out, but beforehand I'm washing them with a little Dawn dish soap. It just kind of gets rid of any bedding or rodent scent or anything like that might be offensive to this particular animal. Trying that.
So you'd actually offer like a washed pinky?
Yeah. So right when I take it out of the freezer, take it over to the sink, put a little dish soap and just rub it, wash it, rinse it really well while it's frozen, put it back in wherever I'm thawing everything else out. And then I would make sure that particular animal gets the one that is now washed, untainted with rodent scent, and see if that makes a difference. If that doesn't make a difference, then I do the same washing technique, but then add either like a chick down, quail feathers, gecko scent. Sometimes that makes a difference. Now that can come from either frozen quail or chicks that I've plucked some down off and saved it in a Ziploc bag, or if I've managed to catch some gecko shed from other geckos at my house or the shop, save them in a Ziploc bag in the same fashion and use them for scenting techniques. And I've had that work with Antaresia.
That's really interesting. And it just kind of reminds me of just how unappealing reptile keepers freezers can be to people that don't.
Yeah, I very quickly realized I needed to have a separate chest freezer for the food just to keep the better half happy. There is no way after I had more than like 2 snakes that I was keeping rodents in the public freezer. So
yeah, I've got a sort of an isolated section.
Yeah, I mean, you can keep it isolated and obviously frozen. It's sterile, no germs. You can put like a cardboard box in there, kind of like section it all off if you really need to, or Tupperware or something. Keep it, super contained. But when you get to a collection of 100+ animals, you can't do that.
No. Yeah, once you get the collection, I'm at 6, and just to get like 6 months worth of food takes up a good chunk of it's just the one of those top freezers on top of the fridge. Yeah. So it's I can imagine having 20 or 30, and it's another expense that people need to consider. Yep. So you brought up a good point. Not all animals eat rodents right out the go. Some will eat pinky mice and stuff, but a lot of small, especially sort of small colubrids and the smaller pythons are going to be eating reptiles. So yeah. What's the situation with that? I really want and this isn't a small reptile, but like a black-headed python are kind of famous reptile starters, or a brand new baby king snake. Maybe I have a little experience and I bred some of the Mexicana kings that are super tiny, but I how do I do that? What do you do for animals that are maybe either too picky for a pinky mouse or too small for a pinky mouse?
That's a unfortunately becoming a very common question in the hobby. I guess it's fortunate because it means people are looking into other obscure species, but there is an answer for it. And if you're anticipating bringing on one of these trouble feeders, or you're anticipating having a litter of them or something like that, and you can plan ahead, the best thing I can suggest to anybody is start a colony of mourning geckos. They are parthenogenic, asexual, whatever you want, not partho, just asexual um, geckos, and they only get about, as adults, about 3.5 inches or so. Babies hatch out about an inch, and they're very prolific, and you can start a colony of them, keep them at room temperature, really minimal food, fruit flies and Pangea, water dish, keep them humid, and they will just reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And so I know a lot of folks that have these colonies, and what they do is they get it to a point where they have a lot of adults, they're all females, that are producing regularly, and they will either with really particularly stubborn animals grab a baby if they can and just throw a live baby in with a picky feeder, because they're really teeny tiny. So something like a Malagasy cat-eyed snake, or even some Candoya, some of the really tiny Candoya boas. Throwing those in there is great. Or if you've got a good colony it's producing, again, I'm sorry for anybody who thinks this is kind of morbid or callous, but take those babies and throw them in a freezer and have like a little frozen stash of geckos that you can use either to feed frozen thawed, scented, things like that. There's a lot of different tricks for that. Other people will source anoles, green anoles or brown anoles from places that they're invasive, and get them in bulk from online distributors, and then house like a small enclosure of anoles. The challenge is anoles are typically a little bit bigger than those geckos, so mourning geckos and house geckos tend to be your best bet. They're pretty small, pretty prolific, pretty affordable, and easy to maintain. The challenge is just getting that colony up and running, so you build up a food store ahead of time.
No, that's really smart, especially with the mourning geckos, because you don't really have to do much to take care of them. They reproduce themselves. You don't have the male dominance of either getting into a fight with the female trying to pair up, or males fighting each other. I will say, if you have mourning geckos, have a very secure enclosure.
Yes, they can get out of anything.
Just about anything.
Yeah.
It's almost from what I've seen, I don't keep them myself, but from what I've read, people basically just say, you're going to have them in your house. If you're very secure, you'll have fewer in your house.
Yeah, that's fair.
So it's like, if you've done everything possible to keep it in, you'll have just one or two.
Yeah.
Because they're just so super tiny when they're born. If you have a wire coming through or something like that.
Oh, that's all it takes. A cord port, a crack on the door when you open it, a little vent that just happens to be big enough, that little baby's gone.
That's interesting. And it doesn't seem like any of the big rodent suppliers offer reptiles that I've seen.
I hope one day that somebody figures out an efficient and ethical way to do it. I think those are the two biggest challenges, because of the cost and the work involved in order to keep those animals alive in bulk. It's just going to make it so that the incremental cost per feeder is probably higher than what most people are interested in paying. Although, as I say that, large rats are over $7 right now. So if there's a way to mass produce house geckos, mourning geckos, green anoles, some of those things, and do it in a way that doesn't become like commercialized gross, like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to see the health and care of the animal sacrificed in terms of just trying to make them as cheap as possible. And maybe that's the reason why it's still kind of like a backyard breeder at home sort of situation at best right now, because it just, in order for the corporate commercialization of it, it's just going to cost too much, or just be too inhumane, or whatever you want to say. Like, I don't want to go down any weird like political animal rights divides on any of that, but I would think that mass producing a lot of geckos could potentially have its downsides if the ultimate goal is to keep the cost as low as possible.
That makes sense. I mean, it's a bit of a tangent, but it's certainly something we should always consider too, when we're sourcing our food, because that was a living animal too, you know.
Yeah.
So it's definitely worth considering. I like the idea of raising your own up, because then you know exactly what's in it. You know it was treated right.
Yeah.
You know it was ethically culled, or
Exactly.
given the nutrients it needs to, because I know folks who grow their own rats, and although I
Hmm.
don't really want to raise rats for reasons of raising rats,
Sure.
they're a lot more maintenance than a reptile.
Yep.
I kind of envy them, because I know that they can put heavy fruit and vegetable loads into their diets, and
Oh yeah.
they can make sure that they're either getting the exercise they need, get them at just the right size, all of that good stuff. But at the same time, I don't want to raise my own
Yeah,
rats.
you'd really have to have a lot of space and time
Yeah,
in order to do it in such a way where you wouldn't feel bad about it and do it right, in my opinion.
right. No, you're absolutely right. I'm the same way. I don't want to, half-heart something and have the rats suffer just because they're food, because
Right.
they at some point they're animals too. They're living animals.
Agreed.
What? So that being said, we talked a lot about snakes not eating. Like, how long? At what point should I start freaking out if my snakes missed a number of meals? Like, how long do these guys go?
Yeah, so again, this answer will vary based on the species, but if you want to break it down into three categories, I would say the faster metabolizing animals are colubrids.
Mm-hmm.
So those guys tend to burn through fat stores faster, eat more frequently, and have higher caloric intake needs. Then your next step would be pythons and then boas. And pythons and boas are almost the same, but I do find boas tend to be better at going like long periods of time and not losing any weight. Not that pythons can't, but again, species specific. There's
Sure.
always exceptions to the rule. But um, colubrids tend to operate and go faster and be more diurnal, so they're awake at higher temperatures and they're just a little more active, so everything metabolically goes faster, so they burn through it faster. So if you've got an animal on a hunger strike and it's, say, a baby corn snake, you should be concerned within a few weeks, because a little colubrid can dehydrate and go down fast very quickly within a month or two.
Mm-hmm.
um, Something like a baby ball python can go a year, if it really has to. You'll see it deteriorate oftentimes, and you'll see fat stores disappear, but pythons and boas tend to be more efficient with their energy consumption and usage, so you see them being able to withstand periods of famine, or whatever you want to call it, of fasting, much better than colubrids. Now, the physical signs that I look for are lateral folds in the skin. So, like, if down the side of the animal it looks like there's more skin and it's not filled out, and you get a
Hmm.
fold, that's a really skinny animal. I have some stubborn baby Crebos that I hatched this year. These little runty boys that are not quite getting the food gig as well as the little female, and so they have that little lateral fold on the side, and so I'm taking
Hmm.
visual stock of that every day. Another thing that is a good red flag early on, especially with pythons and boas, is a deteriorated head musculature. You can even see that in bearded dragons when they're going downhill, is their head looks like concave, like there's like missing tissue, almost like it should be fuller.
That's
um
interesting. I haven't heard that one, because yeah, that's kind of the first thing you notice of that. That's kind of like the archetypical picture of a snake. If it's not a cobra, it's a python or a boa with those big bulging head
mhm,
and upper jaw muscles. And so
mhm.
you're saying that that's like something that you look at to see if it's a skinny snake or
Yeah, I mean,
malnourished or
there
something.
are occasional anomalies in like physical structure that's not going to change, but for the most part, unless you're talking about something that's like a really narrow head, like a milk snake or a corn snake, where there isn't much um differentiation. I mean, even with them as an adult, you should definitely be able to see like a good muscular head, but
Hmm.
that's usually a sign that something's going wrong. Like
Mm.
they're not using those muscles, that they're not feeding, they're not hydrating, they're not really working that out. And that's that you'll see that in runty animals that have not
Yeah.
been going. It's a good red flag.
Oh, that's very interesting. And then, of course, there's animals like king cobras and the Drymarchon genus that are even more active, right? So,
Yeah.
what sort of things are you trying with your Crebo, if you don't mind talking about them a little bit with the babies? Because I know they require even a little bit more creativity, right?
Yeah, so the female eats anything I throw at her. She flipped that
That's
switch
good.
really early on. Tongs, whatever, she'll take it. The two little males, one of them will not eat anything. Like
Mm.
nothing. I assist fed it a pinky a couple weeks ago, and I think that's the only thing that's keeping it alive. I've been throwing minnows in water dishes. I changed the water dishes. At first I was doing ceramic bowls, then I went to clear deli cups so they could see the activity in there.
Hmm.
One of the two started figuring it out and really does pick off minnows here and there, but I have to have like a group of them in there. They have to be active, kind of stirring them up. The other thing that I'm going to alter next is their ambient visibility. I have them in this sort of like 3 divided beta tank. They can see everything. I wanted to give them, ideally when you're raising babies, you want to go the path of least resistance. Do the least amount of work to get the most success possible in order to make it fun, less stressful on the babies, and really make a seamless transition into what will ultimately be their routine. So getting them on the desired and appropriate diet as soon as possible, giving them, whatever stimulus the species needs. These are an active, very visually stimulated animal, so I wanted them to hit the ground with those senses being triggered, but I might have to pull back with the two boys and put them in somewhat more of a sensory deprivation style enclosure to get them
Hmm.
to focus more on one stimulus, i.e., food. So that might require me taking them out of these nice layered substrate moss, hide, leafed enclosures and put them in more of a sterile tub, so that the only thing that's really novel and going on is the absence and presence of food to really force that issue a little bit. I don't know if that'll work or not, because the other variable at play with these guys is that they didn't have the greatest start to life. They did not have the most yolk absorbed out of the eggs or some incubation
Mm.
challenges. So they hit the ground at about half of what they should have been as
Mm.
far as size and weight. So I'm fighting an uphill battle with those two. So
Yeah, it really sounds like it. And so you mentioned assist feeding. Is
mhm.
that something like at what point is that something that a snake keeper should consider?
So before we get into any of this, assist feeding and force feeding are two different things. And if you've never done it, you should definitely have somebody with experience do it for you and learn from them before you get to the point where you're doing it yourself, because you can kill an animal doing it. You can hurt an animal. You can cause irreversible damage, break jaws, especially with delicate little babies. You can
Mm.
aspirate an animal. You can think you're doing it right, and the animal's dead 20 minutes later. That's how
Mm.
bad things can go. So I would say assist feeding and force feeding should be done as a very, very last resort. Alter the husbandry, alter the enclosure, alter the prey, alter the variables within the prey, live versus frozen thawed versus the item itself. You'd be surprised how different some animals respond to a mouse versus a rat. I try to default all my baby carpet pythons to frozen thawed fuzzy mice right out of the get-go. About 4 weeks after they've had their post-ovulatory shed, that gives them about a month and a half to 2 months of being alive to process the yolk they've hatched out with, get hungry, have some time exploring, have some time getting used to me coming in and messing with them and getting some instincts going. Now, the ones 90% of them take that route. The ones that don't, that's when I start exploring mice versus rat. And some of them, it's boom, they just wanted the rat instead.
Mm. Hmm.
Some of them, they just want more time. They want 2 more months or whatever. Some of them, it doesn't seem to have any logic. And then one day they just flip a switch and decide to eat, and some don't. The sad reality of it is there are babies who starve themselves to death. The ones who weren't meant to make it. Something didn't develop right in their digestive system. Something didn't develop right in their coelomic cavity. They didn't get the strong genes for instincts. Whatever it is, it happens. And when you breed enough animals, the numbers of production and what you do, you will see more instances of it. It is not anything you're doing wrong. It is a roll of the dice. In fact, it happens much more often in nature than we realize because of all these other variables that we've eliminated just by virtue of having these animals under our care. So it sucks. It doesn't make it any easier or more tolerable. I just, you can't beat yourself up about it. It is kind of the natural process.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. We raise captive snakes, and in nature, in the wild, a lot of species are dancing right around that 1 in 10 survival rate. Some are more successful, but for a lot of them, and it's not just predators, it's not just illness. Some of them are just too scared to come out and eat, or unable to catch food. It's a bit of it is luck. Anyone that's ever gone herping or hunting knows, or fishing knows, that there's a lot of times you go out and you don't get anything. And if you're doing that to live, right? I mean, I don't need to tell everyone that. What about when you are feeding a snake, or not feeding it in this case, and you have an unused rodent? Is there anything you could do with that? Those can pile up.
They can. So there's a couple things that I do preemptively to avoid that. I spend a lot of money on rodents. I don't want to waste that or be inefficient with that. So without having everything on a structure, I have a regiment for myself. And what I do is I plan out my feedings based on what I'm seeing from everybody else. I can see which animals are in shed. I can see which animals ate last week because I'm keeping records. So I can go through and plan my feeding the day before I want to feed. So tomorrow I'm going to feed. What I've done today is I've gone through with a note card and looked at every single animal and said, okay, who's at what stage? Okay, did you eat last week? Are you in shed? Where are you at in your cycle right now? And that's what dictates what I'm pulling out of my freezer tomorrow morning to feed the next day. And I always account for a few exceptions, but ultimately what it does is it eliminates the amount of waste. So if I'm paying attention to it, and I'm usually pretty in tune, I know which animals aren't going to eat and shed it, so I won't pull for them. I know which animals don't need food because they ate last week, and I don't want them eating that frequently, or whatever it is. Or for breeding season right now, she did eat last week, but I'm also going to feed her again, so it that way every week it's different. And I find I waste very little. That being said, there's always exceptions. There's always animals that surprise you. They just decided, no, they're full, or they weren't in shed before, but they are now, or just whatever. So when you have those rodents that have already been offered to an animal, they've touched an animal, they've been in that animal's enclosure, I typically will not give that to anything else. My only exceptions are my monitor. I have a Savannah monitor, i.e. the garbage disposal. If a small rodent has touched, a baby, and it's not going to be consumed within reason, I will give it to him. But I would much rather throw away a rodent and consider it compromised than compromise an animal in my collection. Again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, sort of approach. So that's where my preemptive planning and list making and everything comes into play. So I try and reduce the amount of waste, because the last thing you want to do is have an animal that you don't know is sick in your collection. Say it's an asymptomatic carrier of Nido, for example, and you offer it a rat, and you keep offering it, and you upset it to the point where it strikes the rat but doesn't take it. Now that animal's saliva is on that rodent, and then you go and pass it to another animal that consumes it. Well, guess what? That's how Nido spreads. So throw it away
within your collection.
Yeah.
So you would not recommend taking an unused unfed item and then just giving it to another snake?
Now, I've heard people use the term B grade rodents, where like they thawed it out in a refrigerator, but they didn't end up actually feeding it or taking it out of the refrigerator or even putting it on tongs and then refreezing it. I personally don't do that. I've seen it done and seen no issues or repercussions. That being said, I'm a rather safe than sorry kind of guy. I
Yeah.
put too much time and effort and focus on my animals to make a sloppy mistake that could potentially result in the death or illness of something that I care about and that relies on my care.
Totally. Lori in the chat says that her cats love them.
Yeah, a friend of mine messaged me last night. He was kind of hysterically laughing yet frustrated because he was thawing some small mice in a cup when his snake room he left for a couple minutes and this cat snuck in there and ate them all. It happens. My cats have not crossed that line yet, and I hope they never do. So we won't tell them that's a thing.
I'm nervous to try it. I don't know if they're gonna hack up a bone or something in my
the former zookeeper in me wants to try it just for enrichment purposes.
Yeah, I want to give it to
a frozen thawed one, not a live one, because they would torture it. But yeah, maybe one of these days.
Well, thank you. Is there any feeding tricks or anything maybe I haven't thought of that maybe discussions you have?
Man.
I was telling you the whole reason I wanted to get into this was a lot of folks ask me, and sometimes I don't know, but I'll end up spending 50, 60 minutes, chatting with someone on Facebook. And so it's always a unique case.
So there's a story and experience I have that I will tell that'll just hopefully ignite some inspiration, and if anybody's listening, I hope they remember it as just like a little oddball story in the back of their head, like a little piece of ammunition. But before I get to that, I will say the piece of advice that I probably rely on most is I look outside of my circle, my niche, my sector, my group of animals, at what everyone else does, what everyone else feels is right, or what they do, or what they feed. And I make that just a part of my regular life. I pay attention to what colubrid circle peoples are doing, what boa circles are people, what aquatic snake people are doing, what chameleon people are doing, what turtle people are doing, like everything is important, because you might just get that little nugget of information that makes a difference from somebody else and apply it in a weird offhand way and find that it works. So, sometimes you just need to step out of your lane and look to the left or the right, and maybe you'll find inspiration elsewhere in somebody else's patterns of behavior. Don't be afraid to ask questions, and try something completely harebrained. And if somebody's telling you you're crazy and that's never going to work, you're probably on the right path. So then the story is, a couple years ago, while I still had children's pythons, I bred children's pythons. The Antaresia complex is notorious for being some of the smallest species of pythons in the world, i.e. the hardest to get appropriately sized food for neonatal babies. Children's pythons being much smaller than the spotteds, but not quite the pygmies. They're pretty tiny. Babies were hatching between 7 and 9 grams, which means they're a couple millimeters in diameter and like 6 inches long at most. So a live freshborn pinky mouse was about the biggest thing they could take. So out of a clutch of 10, 2 of them took right away. The other 8, as expected, were like, no, that's weird.
Right.
Because in the wild, these animals naturally eat little geckos and things. So that's the other thing. You need to really study the natural history of your species. If it's not something that is very mainstream and doesn't eat rodents naturally, it's worthwhile paying attention to that. So, over the coming months, I would try everything from live to frozen thawed to wash to brained pinkies. Braining is another thing where you take a scalpel or a razor and cut the little pinky's fleshy head, soft skull open, and it elicits some of those odors. And some animals like that. It's an old school trick. It's weird. I don't know the history of it. It sounds disgusting, but
just another disgusting thing snake keepers get to do.
Another gross tool in your toolbox.
It becomes totally normal at some point.
Yeah, I mean, shoot, if you find yourself like blending up anoles and geckos in a blender and stuff, you've hit like rock bottom weird, and I applaud you. But then so this was my train of thought. I start getting into these children's pythons. I start thinking about cave dwelling species, rock crevice species, and how they hunt based on their environment. So they're going to wait for the temperature to cool down, i.e. the nighttime. They're going to come out and they're probably going to sit there outside of the entrance of wherever they've been seeking refuge, and be as efficient as possible and not stray too far, and probably wait for something to run by, like a little gecko that will scurry. So in my head, I start thinking, okay, these snakes are coming out of these crevices, are sitting on these little rock faces, waiting for something to run by. Look at where my hand is sitting. If this is the snake, look at what's. So I was like, okay, let's try that. So I grab the baby snakes. I take a frozen thawed pinky that I had washed, and I take some gecko shed, wrap it around that pinky, dip it back in hot water so the water adheres the shed to that pinky. And now the only scent in theory that's present is water, some diluted gecko shed, and that should be it. And taking the tongs, I come up from below and tap the little guy, because he should be, in theory, if I'm holding him right, get him dangling. And I tap him from below. I'm not kidding you. 3 geckos first instance, boop, snakes just wrapped them right up like they'd been doing it their whole lives. It was unbelievable. The first time it happened, I was like, no way. That's just luck. Second animal, same thing. I was like, there's no way. Third one, boom. I was like, okay, I'm on to something here. And I did it a couple more times for those animals, and then eventually pulled the scenting out of it, pulled the positioning out of it, and got it to where they would just take them from the tongs in the enclosure. And it was just about hitting those triggers. And it made a world of difference.
It's remarkable. I mean, I don't want to sit here and just kind of be in awe of it, but that's one of the coolest things about reptiles, being able to see their instincts like that this animal, that worked for it, having never had a meal in its life, whether the wrong way or the right way. And once it did that, it just triggered that for it. So
I love it. I mean, I've since gotten rid of the species because they're so difficult. I mean, and maybe one day I'll regret that. I sort of go back and forth about whether or not I should have kept them. But, you know, I experienced it. I had fun and I learned a lot from it. But yeah, what an honor to learn something about an animal that can't give you facial expressions, communicate. What a blessing. What a pleasure to be able to learn something so intimately, so spontaneously about an animal so cryptic like that. I mean, it's just that experience like that is in itself profound, and I'll never forget that. And I don't know why. And that'll probably always sound weird to somebody who isn't a reptile keeper. But to me, it's not even the accomplishment factor of like, I finally got him to eat. I finally figured it out. It's just like, to see that millions of years of evolution and natural history just align with this crazy hairball idea I had, and it worked 3 times in a row. It was just like, it's like lightning striking.
That's a great story. That's a really cool example of really just following the natural history. Like it kind of cracks me up. I'll see even kind of old school people say it. Oh, that snake doesn't breed in captivity. Or, you know, those are so hard to get started on eating. It's like, well, you know, and these are people that are trying to breed these animals in a tub the same way they breed ball pythons, or they're trying to get a children's python started on a pinky mouse, you know. And you even see it with, like you said, the Solomon Island ground bows, you know, some of those species that it used to be that was, no, just don't buy it. Don't ever end up with it. You can't feed them. They're going to die.
A waste of time. Yeah.
And more I see people getting babies and actually having success. I still, you know, see people post about their new baby, and then I never hear from them again.
Yeah, it's very real still.
But you know, more and more people have raised them who have no business raising those snakes, and it's because there's more information out there, and we study the natural history, and you know, they're getting house geckos for them and stuff too. So.
Absolutely. So my takeaway advice is if something sounds crazy, or somebody's telling you it's crazy or it'll never happen, do it. Like literally take that as a sign that you should do it. Talk to Chuck Pullen. 7-8 years ago, people were telling him Halmahera scrubs will never be produced in captivity. They come in, but people kill them. They never figure it out. Yeah, guess who was the first person outside of a zoological setting to produce Halmahera scrubs? Yeah. So,
and now he put in the effort. He researched them, and now he's got the corner on the market.
And other people are figuring it out now too.
Right.
I mean, Shane just produced them. I mean, that's how it always starts, man. The story of every new species into the hobby starts with, oh, that'll never happen, or it's never been done, or good luck. You'll never figure that out, or they're too mean, or they don't eat, or they don't acclimate. That's always how it starts. Always. Retics, ball pythons, tokays, crested geckos, leopard geckos, you name it. That is how it starts. If you can sit back and have a conversation with somebody, or listen to those little comments or little jabs that people throw out, and you can read between the lines and see like, oh, that's foreshadowing for the future. That's an avenue you could take. I mean, it doesn't always pan out, of course. There's a lot of risk involved, but I mean, if you're interested in progressing and finding out new information and learning as much as I am, when people say don't do it, you'll never do it, that's like an open invite for me to do it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I get it. That's absolutely, I get that desire. And I'm glad that folks like you are able to capitalize on that and try something new.
Yeah.
That's really cool children's python story. My advice whenever anyone says they want a snake but it's having a hard time eating is just get a king snake, because they'll eat anything.
Yeah. The other thing that seems to float around every once in a while is the car seat baby trick.
Oh yeah.
Put it in a bag or a deli cup or something like that. Throw it in the backseat of the car. Go for a drive around town. Run some errands for a couple hours or whatever. Obviously, temperature mindful.
Yeah.
Don't cook your animal, but I can't tell you how many times a non-feeding animal was shipped to a friend. Just be like, good luck, and it ate literally the day it landed. Like, sometimes you just need to travel. Why didn't I think of that? Like, I could have just done laps around my block and you'd have figured it out. Like, come on, man.
That's a really interesting one that I just heard that probably a month or two ago.
Yep.
And I can guess maybe why that might work, but really no clue.
I mean, it could also just be timing aligned with when that animal was finally ready to eat. It just so happened
right
to go on a journey of some sort.
Right.
But yeah, 2019, I produced some Papuan carpets, had one male that just wouldn't eat. 7 months later, I just sent it to Justin Smith. I was like, good luck. No charge. Have it. Yeah, I wish you the best of luck.
Yeah,
he literally ate that night.
Thanks, Riley.
I have no worldly explanation for that other than I'm glad that animal ate. It's alive and well and it's thriving. Whatever it takes. But dang it, I wish I had that answer, that magic key,
One day. Well, thank you, Riley. It's been fun. If there's anything you want to add, say it now. Otherwise, we'll sign off and we'll see you whenever we have you on the next one.
No, the only thing I can say is we need more audience here. I mean, your format is so good. Your content is so good. I mean, people need to hear this stuff. Keep doing what you're doing, because I think this format, this content, this platform is great. And I think once people wake up and realize it should snowball, and this informative structure, I think, is what the hobby needs more of. So you ask me, I'll be here. I want to support this type of content being out here, because I think this is what more people need. So
all right, see you next week then.
Okay, sign me up.
Hey, no, that means the world to me. Thank you. I'm absolutely going to keep doing it. One or two people show up. We've had one or two where we get a dozen or so listening too. So
it's all good. It's not so much the live. It's the ongoing availability of the content. Sure, the live in the moment is great, but as long as people have access to it later, that's the important part, right? So
yeah, and honestly, I'm doing this for me. I learned a lot from who I get have on here. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. If you weren't doing it because you enjoyed it, you would have stopped ages ago. You have a natural curiosity and a knack for it, and it was really cool getting to see you at Anaheim. That was really awesome.
Yeah, it was good running into you. I was just at the moment where I was thinking that I was not going to see like anyone I knew or anything, and I was filming around and I didn't know who was there, and it was good to run into you.
Yeah, it's a different show. The crowd is very different from years past. I agree, for sure.
Yeah, I'm still telling you, I hope that we're just one game back now.
Dude, it's gonna be
each time I meet Riley, I need to make sure that the Dodgers have finally taken the lead.
Well, I absolutely love sports for that friendly rivalry. It's so much fun. Back in Santa Barbara, some of the maintenance crew are all Dodgers fan. 2 hours from LA, get it all.
Santa Barbara is right in that sweet spot where it's really mixed.
Yeah, they come vacation for the day. It's that close of a drive. And I remember Dodgers swept us in some series one year, and I came to work one day with a broom duct taped to my locker.
That's
and
good.
and you can't get any more fun and good stuff than that. I mean, that's on the same level as like the reptile shows and reconvening with people and having some good friendly jibbing and fun,
Yeah.
So I love that.